Hyperledger and other public protocols getting built like EOS, and maybe Tezos gets off the ground one day, we'll see, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a very long list of these protocols, each kind of taking a very novel approach to how do you solve for privacy or transaction throughput or enterprise integration or whatever these things might be. So the problem we set our eyes on when we launched Aion kind of early last year was how would you eventually start to connect these dots? How would you take all of these various protocols and turn them into one seamless ecosystem of networks that could communicate with each other, where you could essentially prove on one blockchain that a transaction had taken place on another, and start to build really interesting applications that cross networks in that way. So that's kind of the focus of what we set out to solve when we launched Aion. The research for this started in about March of 2017. Published our white paper in July. We did our fundraise in between August and October, and we've been kind of building it ever since. So that's a little bit of background. We have kind of three major focuses in the design of what we're doing. One, a system that can be equally applied in private networks as well as public networks, a system that would optimize for scale, and a system that would be interoperable. Interoperable in the sense of being extremely generically interoperable, meaning not only interoperable among our own networks that we launch and deploy, but interoperable among existing networks and future networks that haven't yet been built. So with that in mind, this is kind of a very simple illustration of what we're trying to accomplish. We view Aion as kind of two things in one. One being essentially a routing system through which you can connect existing blockchains. A routing system that allows you to point what we call a bridge at this router and allow transactions to be proven on the router such that they can be picked up by another blockchain. But this router, because of the nature of our industry, is decentralized, meaning in and of itself, the router is a blockchain. So we have a blockchain that operates as this connection between other blockchains. On the perimeter of this routing system is kind of three distinct types of networks that we're enabling. One, existing public blockchains. First connection that we're working on is obviously a connection to the Ethereum blockchain, but then we'll be prioritizing bridges into other public ecosystems. The second is connecting into private blockchains. So either Ethereum-based private blockchains, like the type of stuff that's being worked on at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, or other private blockchains, Hyperledger, R3's Corda system, even centralized systems. At some point we're looking at a very complex ecosystem of multiple types of systems that need to integrate with each other. And finally, what we call spoke networks is the ability to kind of copy the DNA of what we've designed and spin them off into new networks. So infinitely scaling how many times you can run a transaction and run an application that can scale across multiple blockchains. So with this in mind, we're at the stage right now where we're in the process of launching kind of version 1 of this routing network. I'll put the link up later. We're actually in kind of an open beta mode right now, so we're looking for people to kind of jump in and start testing with us. And we're building the first bridge between Ethereum and Aion, which will probably be launching sometime in Q2 of this year, mid-Q2, where you can start to prove and move transactions, move tokens, move value between the Aion network and the Ethereum network. So with that in mind, we have kind of 5 types of interactions that we're designing for when we think about Aion. Without going too deeply into each of these, we're looking at an explosion right now in new adoption of this technology. So when the startup to us is existing companies, existing software companies that are realizing that decentralization is going to become key to the designs of their systems that they maybe have already built in centralized environments. And now there's a lot of these companies, some Toronto-based and increasingly many around the world, that are saying, well, how do I migrate my business model and my system design into a decentralized system design, and how do I maintain relevance in my business model? So building the tools to support these types of startups to kind of migrate their businesses. The enterprise is still a big focus of ours. Our kind of history as a company traces back to working with companies like the Toronto Stock Exchange. We've worked with every one of the major 5 Canadian banks. We've worked with the government of Ontario, the government of British Columbia, major manufacturers in the US, telco companies in Europe. I mean, we want to continue enabling these companies because to us, there's a massive opportunity for these mainstream entities to shift, to move the way they do business, to realize that if they don't shift, they stand to lose. Companies like the one in which we're standing in their building right now. It's an important realization that this is a fundamental shift that enterprises need to take seriously, but they need to be given tools to do that. The third is the DApp developer, and to me this is people that have already been exposed in the industry that are looking for the next layer of interesting applications. We've spent a lot of time talking to projects about how do you build applications that are not inherently tied to a single blockchain. How do you start building applications whose logic and inputs and outputs are natively on top of more than one blockchain? And you don't see a lot of these applications today. You see a lot of applications that are Ethereum-based apps or Bitcoin-based apps or whatever, but you don't see a lot of applications that allow you to, let's say, on a proof of an Ethereum transaction, process a Bitcoin transaction. And that's where we're going to start to see a lot more complex and interesting designs of applications that we want to start enabling by using some of the infrastructure that we're building. Inside the network at the kind of security level, we have two kind of major participants. One we call the validator, which for all intents and purposes you may refer to as a miner. But as we migrate our consensus algorithm, it essentially is the group of entities that are providing that security input to the network. In our first design, this is and I'll walk through this on our roadmap really quickly, but this is kind of a modified version of the Equihash mining that is used in the Zcash network, which you might be familiar with some modifications to kind of make it increasingly ASIC resistant. We just published that code last week, but moving forward, we're moving more into like a delegated consensus model where there are the ability to stake tokens, the ability to provide compute to the system, or the ability just to participate in the creation of new blocks as you kind of move the network forward. And then finally, what we call the bridge builder, which is the node or the servers that will operate at the intersection of networks. So if you one of the ways that we lay this out from an architectural perspective is almost like a Venn diagram between blockchains where each circle represents a network, and the overlap of that Venn diagram is the common group of nodes that exist on both blockchains. And then the function that they need to play in a decentralized mechanism to be able to prove that something happened on one side and then relay that message to the other side. And then be able to do that efficiently and quickly such that that doesn't become a bottleneck in the system. And how do you reward and incentivize those bridge builders to continue operating and maintaining those bridges? So that's a big part of our kind of underlying design. Where this becomes interesting, and Brett mentioned, 2018 seems to be a big year for decentralized exchanges. One of the things that we've been talking to a lot of exchanges about is how do you decentralize exchanges across blockchains? Most decentralized exchanges you may have heard of tend to be decentralized in the sense that they trade ERC20 tokens. They trade on a single blockchain, many asset classes, but decentralized exchanges that cross blockchains are yet to be a real thing, because the challenge of being able to prove transactions in a decentralized way across blockchains today doesn't exist. We've kind of created the irony of our industry is all these decentralized networks that rely very heavily on centralized intersections, exchanges, and these proof points in the middle of these blockchains. We're very focused on this idea of building hybrid public and private systems. So where you can have parts of your business process operating in a private, restricted, permissioned blockchain, but have parts of that also traverse into a public blockchain. So some of these transactions being intended for public scrutiny and for full integrity in a public network, and parts maintaining kind of the privacy of like an enterprise environment or a licensed, regulated environment like a stock exchange or something like that. And then, we're also looking at this as like an interesting opportunity to scale existing public networks. So if you wanted to kind of go off chain to do anything and then revert back to the chain in terms of like final state of a transaction, using a bridge to get off of an existing public chain, processing a number of transactions and bringing the final state back into that public chain. So, there's lots of use cases. We're starting to work with a number of projects that are starting to design around this. But just to give you kind of some ideas. We launched the project from a development perspective in mid-2017. We're in the process now of our first release, which is here listed as kind of phase one. Everything we're doing in phase one maintains kind of very close compatibility to Ethereum applications, to the EVM, to a lot of the work that you would probably be familiar with as Ethereum developers. And then as we move into kind of phase two and phase three, we start to get into new designs of our consensus algorithm, a new virtual machine that we're building in collaboration with a few other projects. But all focused on kind of optimizing for scale and performance while we work on this concept of interoperability. Historically, we've all been Toronto-based. Recently, we started hiring some people around the world, so we're on track to be kind of 4 countries in the next month or so. So we've got a team in Toronto, we have a small team now in Romania, we're hiring a team in Barbados and in Shanghai. And then we'll see, that's kind of first half of 2018, and then we'll see where that kind of scales us to in the second half of the year. I'll skip through this relatively quickly, but this is just you can read more about this in our white paper. But we're getting kind of through our roadmap, some big changes coming on our consensus algorithm. We've started we're finishing kind of our modified version of the EVM, which the code is already published on, and we're asking people to kind of review and give feedback to. And then we're also, finalizing on some of the research steps of what we call the Aion virtual machine, which we'll start going into development in the next month or so. Finally, the bridge designs, we've got kind of two major bridges that we're designing. The first is our ability to be able to take our token, which we launched as an ERC20 on Ethereum, and essentially autonomously migrate it to Aion without having a centralized single point of exchange or single swap event, as you've probably seen if you follow other projects that do kind of like a token to coin swap at some point in their progression. So building this kind of flexible, decentralized model where you can take tokens and shift them into coins, and eventually take those coins and shift them back into tokens. We're starting to build kind of the foundations of what does it look like for a token to exist in a single supply across multiple blockchains. So if you think about it today, it's very, it's difficult to kind of to imagine what that would look like. You say, hey, I've got 100 million of token X, and I want that token to be able to freely exist on top of more than one blockchain. But I want that 100 million supply to be constant. I don't want that supply to double every time a blockchain forks or I relaunch the contract on another chain. So how do you essentially go through the process of locking and unlocking supply on two sides of a bridge such that you can have a single supply of a coin across more than one blockchain? And this is a conversation that we've been having a lot with exchanges, both centralized and decentralized exchanges, which is a really interesting twist for them, because now you go and you say, hey, I want to trade a coin on an exchange, and there's a single format in which that coin is. It's a Bitcoin or it's an ERC20. It's very simple. You deposit that format, and you withdraw that format, and you exchange that format. But increasingly, we're going to start seeing coins that might exist in 3 or 4 underlying formats. You may have a coin that has a format of ERC20 and a format of a native coin on a blockchain and a format of a QRC on Quantum. And how do I allow for a very single, user experience from an exchange perspective, but allow kind of the backends to be different depending on where it's trading. So we're probably farther along than 75% now. We're getting pretty close to our first token bridge protocol. In terms of our vision, we're looking at many of these projects are ones we've partnered with. Some are just kind of logos that we threw up to just illustrate what we're looking at. We look at the industry today as being extremely fragmented, but also increasingly interesting. There's a lot of new protocols that are gaining traction. A year ago, it was very rare to hear about $1 billion blockchain. Today, there are probably 30 or 40 billion dollar blockchains. And we think that number is probably going to continue growing. And we think that each of these are going to find niche and interesting use cases. Some are going to fail and disappear over time, but we anticipate that more than one will survive the test of time. And if that's true, then we need to start allowing for kind of the seamless communication between these networks, and the seamless communication between those networks and older systems like SAP, and we MX up there because we like giving our clients shout outs. But all of this ability to kind of move transactions between all these systems, and then incentivizing those bridges along the way. So how do you create kind of an economic system that incentivizes those connections for happening? This is an extremely outdated slide. I keep criticizing us for not taking new pictures of our new people, but we're probably about 6 or 7 more than this in Toronto, not including our teams that we have started hiring outside of Toronto. But if you're looking for a job, if you're a developer, if you're not a developer, if you're interested in kind of learning more, we're not too far away. We're just down the street, just at Richmond and Yonge, and we'd love to talk to you. And before I let you go, kind of 2 quick things. One, we're hosting our first inaugural event attached to the Ethereum EdCon conference, which is coming to Toronto in May. So we're sponsoring EdCon, which is happening on May 3rd to May 5th. Where we'll be presenting and probably demonstrating some of the functionalities of this Ethereum bridge. And then the day before is Aion X, which we're hosting, and essentially a dedicated day to talk about chain interoperability, to talk about some of the solutions that can be built in an environment where chain interoperability is solved. So we'd love to have you out. There'll be more details coming up on this online, probably in the next 2 weeks or so. And then finally, if you're a developer and you're kind of interested in learning more about what we've built, where our designs are going, first you can check us out at aion.network just to read our white paper, check out some of our documentation. But if you want to dive in a little bit deeper and start talking to our team, check out our forum, sign up for our beta test network, or dive in on our GitHub and give us your feedback. Yeah, that's kind of it for now. Thanks so much, guys.